Here we have a paper, also just published in Biology Letters. This is actually from the end of looks like it's slightly earlier. Actually, it's not just published. I just ran into it. Adaptation of sperm whales to open boat whalers. Rapid social learning on a large scale, question mark. Awesome, right? And so, obviously, so they're looking at North Pacific whaling in the 19th century. And so they're looking at logbooks, whalers' logbooks. So it's indirect that way. And then they're modeling. And so the modeling is kind of a black box. I didn't pursue their all of the data and the models that they have online. I just read through this article where they say we've got all the explanations online, but they seem to be doing a really compelling job here. Let me just share a couple of quotes. Some historians have suggested that the success. I'm going to start over. Some historians have suggested that the success rate of open boat whalers and harpooning sighted whales, the second stage in these whaling operations, dropped substantially during the initial years of industrial exploitation, and that this was due to socially learned changes in whale behavior. The development of pelagic whaling operations in the North Pacific by American whalers during the middle 19th century is well chronicled in digitized whalers' logbooks, so that's the source of their data. We assessed whether this decline was caused, so they do see that there are declines in efficacy, okay?
Which will reduce the effect of the hunt. So it's confounded by that.
It's confounded by that, but they actually have 4 hypotheses. And again, they're using their model to assess, and I don't love the way that they've been forced to assess what they're doing, but the fact that they lay out 4 alternative hypotheses up front is such a refreshing change from how most so-called scientific papers are written. They say, we assessed whether this decline was caused by socially learned changes in the defensive behavior of the whales. That's their primary hypothesis, hypothesis X, they call it. Evaluating support for several alternative hypotheses using causal models. The first whalers on aground were particularly proficient. That's hypothesis 1. The whalers initially captured especially vulnerable whales. Hypothesis 2, or the whales learned to escape whalers from their own individual experience of encountering them, hypothesis 3. So that's different from their main hypothesis, and that's individually learned, like individuals learn to evade as opposed to their social learning. There's transmission of social stuff between groups. And in fact, it's even a higher bar than it seems. Like they're asking, could groups of whales have communicated information to other groups of whales? And they find, and without going into the methods at all, the between-unit social learning model fits the data better than all other causal models, producing a rapid decline in strike rate as units learn defensive models measures from one another.
All right, so a number of reactions.
Yeah.
1, super cool.
Yeah.
2, really skeptical. You've got a bunch of mechanisms, and as far as I can tell, none of them are mutually exclusive. So to say one fits the data better.
Again, I did not spend enough time, and I just am not a fan of the modeling approach.
Right.
And it was all they had.
Yep.
So
But nonetheless, they could all be true, and in fact,
but to hear them talk about it, they find it was hardest for them to distinguish between the social learning model and the individual's learning model. That it was easier to get rid of the other two.
And I think they may have. It's possible I'm overlooking it, and I apologize to them if I'm about to suggest that they do something that they actually did. But there's actually more range in here because you could have.
You mean in terms of hypotheses?
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you fans of our book will be familiar with this style of thought, but there are 2 ways that you could get a change in group behavior or lineage behavior that would result in an improvement in the odds of the whales against the whalers. One is that there's variation between the whales in how they behave, which there will be, and that the ways of being a whale that made them vulnerable to the whalers began to decline because the whalers had success against them, and the ways of being a whale that were incidentally more effective at not being spotted or not being successfully pursued than would propagate just by virtue. So that is
So
selection.
that's different from vulnerable. So their use of the term vulnerable is like old, weak, young, whatever. And you're saying basically that there will be a selective spread in a population behaviorally, and some behaviors that weren't putting them at risk before put them at risk of whaling, and that part of that behavioral spread will simply be selected out by whaling,
Right. So
which won't read as vulnerable because they don't have the demographic measures of vulnerability.
And this will, I don't mean to diminish it. That really is selection producing adaptation, and the nature of the adaptation is immunity to whaling.
But that's not social learning.
Right.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it could be social learning, and there are multiple ways that it could be social learning. There's a question about, again, individuals who succeed, and those individuals who succeed then being, let's say, even mimicked by other whales, right? A successful...
Well, mimicry sounds like social learning.
Well, I'm not discounting that it's social learning, but I'm arguing if these were humans, right, you would have two things competing. You would have humans succeeding at various things that would propagate, and you would have humans discussing the problem and coming up with possible solutions, right? Now, in whales, we have a highly intelligent, these are sperm whales.
Yeah.
We have a highly intelligent animal that does not have language. They communicate, but they don't have language, right? So their ability to propose things to each other is, on the one hand, it would seem extremely limited from the human perspective. On the other hand, maybe not, right? Because they can show, right? So whale communication might be a lot more show than tell, but nonetheless...
Maybe, although, the long-distance vocalizations, right? But very short distance, what you can see in water, and if you're so close that you can see it, you're presumably at risk from the same whalers.
Right, exactly. But, we see much smaller toothed whales like dolphins learning special techniques for, corralling fish and hitting them with their tails and things like this.
From watching, but there's no risk to them in the watching, whereas there would be risk to whales
I'm just arguing,
in watching here.
You've got a mechanism for the transmission of information that, I don't know if whales can propose things to each other by showing, but that's a possibility. And so you could get...
Oh, you mean later,
Right. Like that was close, but watch this, right? Watch what I would do, right? Here's what I did. Right, yeah. Exactly. So, that could be fanciful imagining of what whales might be doing. It might be projecting a human style thought process on them. On the other hand, we're talking about a highly intelligent mammal.
Yeah, and or I did something that worked. I'm gonna practice that a bunch because that worked, and then others watch it and look what he's doing. I wonder if that's what worked.
Right. So, in some sense, the point is we argue that consciousness is about getting ahead of this process. So selection doesn't have to solve the problem because you can actually mentally model a problem, pool your insight with others who are mentally modeling the same problem, and come up with a solution that you didn't have before that actually works. And then you can try it in the real world and see whether you had it.
Yeah.
Whales have some of our tools, not all of our tools, and they have them in different proportions. But the point is it interfaces very closely here with the question of, how did the whales get better at this, right? So anyway, fascinating stuff.